No war has been more thoroughly covered by cameramen than this one. Every day from all over the world, thousands of feet of film arrive at the Signal Corps Photographic Center in Astoria, New York. Inside these buildings, a landing is taking place in the Philippines. A platoon is storming a pillbox in Germany. An infantryman waits patiently for a jerry to cross his sights in Italy. At the SCPC, technicians process the film. Here it is edited, narrated, and its final distribution decided upon. A single sequence may find its way into the newsreel, a special photographic report for the General Staff, a combat bulletin or training film, or the Army-Navy Screen magazine, which with this issue marks its second year of existence. 52 issues produced under the supervision of the Information and Education Division, dealing with almost every phase of the war. Perhaps you'd like to take a look backward at some of the representative stories of the Screen magazine, which began in May 1943 under the title, The War. The feature story of the first issue was an appropriate one. Recently released film of the Jap attack on Pearl Harbor. The smoke billowing into the sky that morning of December 7th was a signal to every American that the time had come. But by 1943, many of those ships bombed on December 7th were already recommissioned and had struck back at the Japs, as in the Battle of the Coral Sea. On their return, veterans of that action were interviewed by the magazine in its second issue.
We were expecting trouble that day, Tom.
Yeah, plenty of trouble. The Japs had a big task force out off the Santa Cruz Islands looking for us, and we were looking for them. And all hell started popping.
Japs that got by you guys would probably try to knock us off Guadalcanal.
They would have knocked you guys off if we weren't there.
Well, they never did.
On the home front, civilians were beginning to feel the pinch of war, too. Rationing. And the Screen magazine, in its second issue, tried to explain the maze of ration boards, points, and coupons. It was all a little hard to understand at first, just as were some of the new training men presented in the same issue. Swimming with full gear. Jumping off 50-foot platforms. Maneuvering through burning oil. To many soldiers, the war was still far away. But not to the soldiers of England, where in issue 4, the magazine turned its camera skyward and caught the RAF in action. War was not new to the pilots in these planes, who had so valiantly defended their country against invasion in 1941. Now skimming over the waters of the English Channel, and they were carrying on until we could throw our full power in with them. In issue 4, the Screen magazine presented the only man who might prevent this.
Snafu. Situation normal. All fouled up. This is Snafu.
But fortunately, there were other soldiers than Snafu. Like the men who landed on the Jap-held Aleutian island of Attu in May of 43. Cold and mud and Japs holed up in the bleak hills. While the crack of American guns was being heard in strange places all over the world, back home, the Army was constantly inducting new soldiers. Like Jake, whom the Screen magazine interviewed in issue 10. It was an all-out war, and Jake was ready to do his duty, which he found a pleasure. But the war didn't stop for Jake and the thousands of new soldiers to finish their training. B-24s out in the Pacific were dropping bombs on islands which were fly specks on most maps. From the sea, the Navy was throwing in 8 inchers to clear the way for landing forces who were discovering that the road to Tokyo was a series of Jap-infested jungles. This particular action, seen in Screen Magazine 11, was on the island of Rendova. From the other side of the world, another island leaped into America's headlines. On the night of July 9th, 1943, the skies above the Mediterranean were cut by the fire of tracers. By dawn, the snub-nosed landing boats had hit the beaches of Sicily. Americans, British, and Canadians slopped through the surf, their guns at the ready, to take the strategic island which was within sight of the fascist mainland. By now, Americans had discovered nothing about this war was easy. In the Pacific, the Japs were discovering that too, and in a more bitter fashion. MacArthur's men went after the Japs in New Guinea in full force. The 5th Air Force smashed Lae, softening it up for the paratroopers who, with the British, moved in and moved in hard. In China, the citizens rolled their ancient fields into airports for the Flying Tigers. In the Central Pacific, a Navy task force hit with all its might an island which 2 years before, a small band of Marines had died defending. Wake Island. The war was speeding up on every front except one.
Oh, the Air Force gets the glory and the Navy gets the cheers. But all a dog-face ever gets is mud behind the ears. Yeah, the tank boys ride in comfort, and the sailor takes a sail. But the dog-face never gets a chance to sit down on his tail. Oh, feet in my shoes, I got them infantry blues.
But not all GIs were walking. In issue 16, the magazine went along on a 3-day pass in India. Yes, men from Brooklyn and Kalamazoo were becoming citizens of the world. In the same issue, the magazine reported on some GIs who were also taking a trip, but not to see the sights. The soldiers of the United Nations were hitting the back door of Hitler's fortress. This was Salerno, Italy. Naples, Cassino, Anzio, Rome, and the Gothic Line. One of the toughest fights in a tough war. From the rubble in the shell-torn streets of Salerno, the magazine in issue 17 went to a party back home. Cake and ice cream and a Christmas tree for the children of the men on the USS North Carolina, who had chipped in so that every one of their kids would get a present Christmas morning. Issue 18, the magazine reported another home front story. The story of labor and management's quick conversion from peace to war, from vacuum cleaners to flare guns in a matter of weeks. And it was also the story of American ingenuity finding substitutes for the vital war materials cut off from us by the Japs. One by one, the Japs were losing the islands they had grabbed. This was the island of Tarawa on November 20th, 1943. It was American Marines versus the picked Imperial Jap Marines. It was a hot fight, bitter and deadly, but it was no draw. The magazine presented this close-up of battle in the Pacific in issue 21. Then in its next issue, it turned to another phase of the war in another theater. A Burma outpost, hundreds of impassable jungle miles from civilization. Here were the men who were the advanced eyes and ears of their outfits, holding down lonely, timeless jobs on the ragtag end of the line. Their only contact with their bases were the planes of the AAF, which by 1943 were streaking across the skies of the world. Here in Burma, it was supply. In Britain, it was battle. The 8th Air Force had grown into a mighty fleet which sprang from the airfields of England to pound the vital centers of Germany day after day. The Flak, the Luftwaffe, never stopped them. With good flying weather, their coming was as sure as the sunrise. But this wasn't the only air activity the Screen magazine was reporting on.
Another smashing blow against the enemy is underway.
And in issue 24, the Army-Navy Screen magazine presented still another Air Force in action. Army and Navy planes softening up the important Marshall Islands for the attack and the landing. We were closing in on Japan. This time it was the 4th Marines and the 7th Infantry who knocked out a vital enemy stronghold and sent hundreds of Japs to their ancestors. All Tokyo could say, as her soldiers crawled out of their reinforced foxholes, was, "One must admit that the situation in the Pacific is most grave. The Marshalls were ours." But what does an island look like after it's been wrested from the Japs? What goes on there? In issue 25, the Screen magazine looked at the island of Munda a few weeks after we took over. Here it saw well-trained engineer troops repairing the battle-rent island, smoothing out the ground pitted with shell craters and foxholes into airfields for our bombers and fighters. Hard work and loneliness, and little glory. Dreams of places back in America like the Hollywood Canteen, which holds open house every night for GIs and Blue Jackets. The night the Screen magazine visited the canteen in issue 26, Dinah Shore was on hand.
Hello, fellas. We had some guests of honor here the other night. Convalescent men from an Army hospital. And they seemed so darn glad to see the canteen again that we thought maybe you'd like to take a look. Especially you fellas who are so far away from home. So let's look around. You be our honored guest tonight. Okay? You're greeted at the door by Lana Turner, Deanna Durbin, and Marlena Dietrich. Probably you'll find Judge and Mrs. Hardy behind the snack bar. That's Louis Stone and Fay Holden, with Jenny Sims and Virginia Widener. On stage, a song from Eddie Cantor.
Go on a roll tonight, we're snug as can be. Being alone is just sublime. You know, her coffee could be sweeter, but I'm in the dumps, cause every time she hugs me, it's like 2 extra lumps. We're staying home tonight, my baby.
While Hedy Lamarr hands out autographs.
From Hollywood, the magazine jumped to the other side of the continent, New York, and interviewed the late Honorable Alfred E. Smith in his last Screen appearance. We asked him to tell us about his beloved East Side in wartime.
You hear a lot about democracy, but sometimes it is difficult to define. The East Side is made up of every nationality and religion, and is a good example of democracy at work.
With Al Smith as guide, the cameras of the magazine in issue 27 looked in on Americans of all faiths and extractions in Lower Manhattan, who were working together 24 hours a day to help win the war in whatever way they were able. Perhaps the sons of some of these people were in the planes that took off from England on the night of June the 5th for the pulverizing attack on the coast of France. The attack which paved the way for the greatest invasion fleet in history. This was France, and the beginning of the end for Germany. At home, the people of America drank in the news eagerly, quietly. The invasion of Europe was the moment Americans had been waiting for. And when it came, it was difficult to know how to take it. A great victory, a great many casualties. The churches were crowded that day with mothers and sisters and fathers and wives of the men fighting in France. School children solemnly repledged their allegiance to the flag. The heart of America was 3,000 miles away on a strip of beach in Normandy. But to these Russian civilians, the magazine reported on in issue 35, war was more than headlines and radio broadcasts. These pictures were taken within the enemy lines when the Germans were on Russian soil. Here was a story not of an army against an army, but of people against an army. Of people determined, fighting for their land, their homes, and their children. That was life in Europe in the historic summer of 1944. This was life in Iowa the same summer. In issue 36, the magazine visited the 40 acres of fine Iowa farmland owned and worked by Scott Ellis and his family. War had come to this peaceful farm, too. With 2 sons in service and a manpower shortage, Scott had troubles running his farm, but he found a solution.
I suppose you fellows noticed my daughter this morning at breakfast. Farmer's daughter, you know. Well, she's not only a farmer's daughter, she's son to me now. My oldest boy's in the South Pacific. There's Bev now, gone for next week's planting.
Hiya, fellas.
Many of the men who had once turned back the rich Iowa soil were now thousands of miles away, heading down the country roads of France toward the city of Paris, which had been dark with 4 years of German occupation. Now the end of that occupation was at hand. In issue 38, the magazine showed film of the underground rising to strike against the invaders. The streets of Paris rang with the shots of men fighting for their freedom. The fight ended with the Free French forces and American infantry and armor rolling into the city to help finish the job. The world was jubilant. The capital of France was liberated. Back in our capital, the news of the United Nations successes poured in, and the government of the United States began to prepare for the returning servicemen with the passage of the GI Bill of Rights. The Screen magazine attempted to explain the general principles of the bill, how an ex-soldier or sailor would be given money to continue his education, how a returning serviceman who was starting his own business would get a financial boost from the government, how money would be advanced to buy property or a home, how employment bureaus and trade schools were established for men who wanted to learn new skills. Americans were determined that this time, the men who fought for their country would find a place in it when they returned. 53 issues. And what you've seen are only extracts from a few typical Army-Navy Screen magazines. It was difficult deciding what to include in this 53rd issue. We might have shown you a bit from our command performances starring Bob Hope, or the report on the last election, or some shots of the magazine's by request department, or the amazing story of the FBI's fight against spies and saboteurs. It was hard to choose, but perhaps our favorite shot was this, the raising of the flag on Tarawa. Somehow this simple ceremony symbolizes our battle all over the world. The magazine will always remember what the Marine cameraman who made this shot said. When that flag went up, we all knew we were in on a good thing. That about sums it up for every man fighting from Germany to the island of Okinawa in the Pacific. We all knew we were in on a good thing.